I rise in support of the legislation, or the amendment, I should say, that's been proposed today by my colleagues from Maine and Oklahoma, Senators Snowe and Coburn, the Freedom from Restrictive, Excessive Executive Demands and Onerous Mandates Act of 2011. This is I think, very commonsensical piece of legislation. It's something that certainly responds to a concern that I hear from small businesses all across this country about the need for relief from burdensome one-size-fits-all federal regulations. And, you know, we hear a lot of discussion here in the Senate and around this town and around the country, for that matter, because that's where it really matters, about creating jobs. And yet, for all the rhetoric about job creation, it seems that there is very little that is actually being done with regard to the substance of putting the right kind of policies in place that will make it cheaper and easier for small businesses to create jobs. It seems like everything that we do here makes it harder, more difficult, and more expensive for our small businesses to create jobs. And as the senator from Maine has very correctly pointed out, 70% of the jobs in our economy are created by small businesses. And I think that there are a whole range of issues that impact small businesses in this country and their ability to create jobs. My colleague from Ohio just talked about trade. I happen to have a view on trade that you ought to have trade agreements that are fair, that are enforceable, obviously, but that we are a country that benefits enormously from the opportunity to export the things that we grow and make here to other countries around the world. And just to give you an example of one particular country, one of the bilateral trade agreements that is under consideration, or at least I wish was under consideration, has been negotiated and has not been submitted by the White House yet to the Congress for consideration, is the one with Colombia. And I mentioned this earlier today in some remarks on the floor, that if you look at it and its impact on agriculture in this country, in 2008, in the commodities of corn, wheat, and soybeans, our country had 81% of the market, Colombian market, when it comes to those three agricultural commodities. In 2010, that was down to 27%. Why? Because a lot of other countries that had negotiated free trade agreements with Colombia have stepped in to fill the void, because we don't have that kind of an agreement. And so, Madam President, this has very direct and profound impacts on the American economy. Because when you lose that kind of market share, 81% in 2008 down to 27% in 2010, that is a significant amount of jobs that are impacted by industries in this country. Same thing would be true with Panama and South Korea, all of which would be our trade agreements that are teed up, that have been sitting and languishing for 3 or 4 years now without action in the United States Senate. It is absolutely insane for us not to be moving trade agreements that could benefit our economy and create jobs at a time when job creation, certainly at least rhetorically around here, is stated to be the #1 priority that we deal with. You know, when it comes to jobs in the economy, and I think there are a number of things, as I said, that impact that, trade being one, but a number of policies coming out of Washington that impact small businesses and their ability to create jobs. Clearly, tax policy is one. Tax policy is something that I think needs to be reviewed in this country. We need tax reform. It's long overdue. It's making us non-competitive with other countries around the world because our tax laws are outdated relative to other countries. Our tax rates are higher relative to every other industrialized country in the world, with the exception perhaps of Japan. That is something that we need to be looking at if we're serious about being competitive and about growing our economy and in the global marketplace, creating the kind of jobs that we need here at home. We've got to have trade policies, tax policies that are conducive to economic growth and job creation. The other area, however, that we really can be impacted by what happens in Washington is regulations. And that's what this particular amendment is really all about. It's about making regulations coming out of Washington, D.C. reasonable, making them based upon common sense, making them based upon science, making them just from any objective bystander or person out there, observer, who looks at these regulations to say, you know, they're trying really hard not to make it more difficult for small businesses to create jobs in this country. But I think what happens too often is the exact opposite. it looks like what's coming out of Washington are heavy-handed, burdensome requirements, mandates, and regulations which drive up the cost of doing business in this country. And frankly, I don't disagree with what some of my colleagues on the other side have said about regulations that are important to public health and safety. What I am talking about here is excessive, overreaching regulations which, Madam President, in some cases go beyond the congressional intent, the statutory purpose that Congress, when they enacted the laws, wanted to see take place. And so you've got regulatory agencies that go way beyond the congressional intent in the statutory purpose with regard to many of these policies that are being put in place. Now, I have to say, Madam President, that when I travel my state of South Dakota, and for that matter, outside the state of South Dakota, and I talk to small businesses, I talk to agricultural producers, the just overriding theme, consistent theme that I hear over and over and over again is you have got to get these regulatory agencies, these out-of-control regulatory agencies, under control. They keep spinning out and kicking out more and more regulations that are making it more difficult for us to grow our businesses and to create jobs. Now, maybe that's a function of the fact that we have a government that has gotten too big and out of control. If you look at government today relative to historical standards, we're looking at government as a percentage of our entire economy today being somewhere in the 24 to 25% range. I mentioned earlier this morning in some remarks on the floor that back in the year 1800, government was actually 2% of our entire economy. Our entire economic output at that time, 2% represented what we spend on federal government. Today we're spending a quarter of every dollar of our entire economic output is just federal government. That doesn't include state and local governments. When you add those in, you get up over 40%. And the trajectory that we're on today will take us up to 40% spending on federal government to GDP in the not too distant future. If you look at 2035, 2040, that's where we are headed if we stay on our current path. So it necessarily follows, I suppose, that when government keeps getting bigger, more expansive, more government regulations, more government red tape, more bureaucracy, it is a natural outgrowth of a growing government. What I frankly think makes the most sense, Madam President, is for us to be creating jobs in the private economy. And what we've seen here in just the last few years is the government economy is growing relative to the total economy. The private economy, thereby, is shrinking. Because we've seen over the last 40 years, the average of the federal government as a percentage of our entire economy being 20.6%. So 20.6% of our entire economy is spending by the federal government. As I said, now it's 24 to 25%. So we are on a path. We are rapidly ramping up, rapidly growing the size of government relative to our entire economy. That, Madam President, is not where we want to go if we're serious about creating good-paying, permanent jobs for people in this country. Those jobs originate and come from the private sector. They come from small businesses. That's where we want to create the jobs in this country. And so I would say that the amendment that's being proposed by the senator from Maine and the senator from Oklahoma is a very reasonable one, because all it's simply saying is that before these new regulations go into place, that small businesses ought to have access to some review and perhaps even, if necessary, to the court system to make sure that those regulations are consistent with the legislative intent and not overly burdensome and putting an unnecessary and excessive burden on our small businesses. And so I think it's a very common sense, and if we're serious about job creation, if we're serious about economic growth, getting the economy back on track, this is the very type of legislation that we ought to be supporting. Too often around here, we end up off on these tangents, working on things that really don't have an impact on job creation. I will say that one of the things that we should be working on and that we're not, and it's now been 771 days since Congress passed a budget. Think about that. $3.7, $3.8 trillion in annual spending, and it's been 771 days now since Congress passed a budget. It strikes me at least that if we are serious about getting our fiscal house in order and sending signals to the economy and to the market that we want to create jobs, the first thing that we could do is get the fiscal house in Washington, D.C. in order. And yet we've had 771 days now without a budget. I think if you are really serious about getting the economy back on track, you have to also restrain spending. You've got to grow the economy, you've got to restrain federal spending, and because when you have a government that's growing at the rate that ours is, it does crowd out private investment. It makes it more difficult for small businesses to get access to capital to create jobs because they're competing with the government. But back to the issue at hand here, and that's regulations. I just think that whether it's a farmer or rancher in South Dakota, and by the way, I spoke yesterday with someone who was in town representing a livestock organization in my state, number one issue, overreaching government regulations, driving up the cost of doing business in this country. And you look at some of the proposals and suggestions that are out there, and sometimes it's falls into the category of you can't make this kind of stuff up. There was a proposal under consideration here recently at the EPA, which they have not, to be fair, promulgated regulations on yet, or proposed regulations on yet, but that would regulate fugitive dust. I mean, imagine and think about what that means in an agricultural area of this country. What essentially means is you couldn't have dust from your property drift over onto someone else's property. Some of this stuff just borders on insanity. And I think that's the point that is being made by the amendment by the senator from Maine, is let's use some common sense. Let's use some reason here. If we're going to have these regulations, at least put them forward in a way that doesn't disproportionately, adversely affect small businesses and make it more difficult for them to create jobs. Another example, just last month, the DOT started seeking comment on the need for commercial driver's licenses for individuals who are driving off-road farm equipment like tractors. Well, where I come from, that's a pretty important part of our economy. You've got a lot of young people working in farm operations, a lot of people, period, who are out there who grow up learning or knowing how to drive tractors, how to handle farm equipment, and this particular requirement would force them to get a commercial driver's license. I mean, some of this stuff, like I said, it falls into the category of you can't make these kinds of things up. The EPA recently threatened ranchers in the Flint Hills region of Kansas to stop or limit the controlled burn of their prairie pastures, which is a practice that allows for the new growth of grass to feed cattle, or to be faced with EPA-mandated regulations. The list, Madam President, goes on and on and on. And it strikes me again that when you have as many of these studies that are out there and lots of data to support these arguments, that we ought to be responding in a way that recognizes that science, data, input from people who are impacted by these regulations ought to have more of an influence on the regulations that are imposed by these agencies. And what this does is it simply puts in place a way in which small businesses can get access to that kind of a review. And so I hope that my colleagues here in the Senate will support the Snowe-Colburn amendment and move us in a direction where we are dealing fundamentally with the issues that are important to our economy right now. Because for all the rhetoric, as I said earlier, about wanting to grow the economy and create jobs, it seems like every policy coming out of Washington, D.C. is contrary to that objective. And again, whether that's tax policy, trade policy, energy policy, but perhaps more importantly now than ever, regulatory action coming out of the executive branch of the government and running amok by creating all kinds of roadblocks and hurdles and impediments to job creation in this country. Again, when you're at 9.1% unemployment, when you have as many people out of work as we have and who have been out of work for as long as they have, you would think that first and foremost, we would be looking at policies that make it easier and less expensive to create jobs in this country. And what is happening is we are making it more difficult and more expensive to create jobs by these excessive, overreaching, runaway regulations that are coming out of federal agencies every single day. It is, Madam President, hands down, the thing that I hear more than anything else from people in my state of South Dakota. As I said, whether that's the Farm Bureau or a livestock group or a small business organization, regulations, government regulations right now is the thing that they state most often as the biggest impediment to them going out there and creating jobs. So this is a very common sense amendment. It's something that our small businesses are all supporting. You saw the list of small business organizations that the senator from Maine put up earlier. This, to me, is something that this Senate ought to act on and act on today, and I hope we will get a strong affirmative vote. Madam President, I yield the floor.